Welcome everybody to a special edition of The Signal from the Bucks County Beacon. This is Kevin Mahoney, and I'm usually the person behind the scenes editing all these awesome interviews featured on this podcast. But today, I'll be guiding the episode as Cyril Mychalejko, editor-in-chief of the Bucks County Beacon, joins me to reflect on this week's primary elections. We'll take a look at the results and focus a bit on two of the contested Democratic primaries in Bucks County. The PA first, of course. Those folks are going to face Brian Fitzpatrick in November. And the PA 16th state Senate seat will go up against the Moms for Liberty darling Jarett Coleman in November. What do the results mean in November's midterms? We'll kind of poke around on that. And we'll also take a little stroll down memory lane as Cyril celebrates his 4th anniversary with the Beacon. That's right, Cyril basically is the equivalent of a presidential term with the Beacon. 4 more years! 4 more years! And what a few years it has been. Hey, Cyril, it's great to be here with you once again and for another session of looking forward, looking back.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. Great to see you.
Yeah, it's been, I like this little tradition, kind of doing the postmortems on the elections, some initial takeaways and thoughts about what's going on, and then kind of looking forward to the road ahead. I mean, I think it's really useful as part of the ongoing discussion and kind of really growth of this discussion in Bucks County and beyond.
No, absolutely. I mean, this primary season was pretty contested, and in some ways exciting as as the country kind of looks toward November and the implications of this, very important midterm election, which could really, we're at a fork in the road, essentially. And I'm hoping that we choose the path to the left, which is the path towards going back towards democracy.
Democracy, sanity, equality. Let's run down the list. Anti-corruption. I mean, seriously, there's a lot at stake in the upcoming election. So maybe we can start kind of broad and then we could kind of move into Bucks a little bit. But I'm just curious your kind of overall take on what kind of primaries across Pennsylvania, anything that stood out for you. And of course, the big story that's made all the national news has been the Chris Robb's big win in Philly. And all that kind of laid bare about some of the really kind of shady behind the scenes stuff and tensions within the party. But Chris Robb has been a fighter for a long, long time. And he came out with that big win in Philly.
Yeah, it just shows that the Democratic Party is a big tent party, to use that kind of tired old slogan and saying. And there's it's true. And there's a lot of, there's people have different ideas about, what the perfect candidate might look like, what type of politics and policies we should be pushing, and Chris Rabb was kind of, he represents the left progressive wing of the party. And I thought it was interesting that he won despite the party establishment solidly behind his main opponent, Street, in the primary that just passed, which included not just Governor Shapiro, but the mayor of Philly as well, Parker.
Absolutely. Really getting behind there. And, it was very interesting to me because Chris Robb, too, he's been around, he's been organizing. He has been outspoken and unwavering in his commitments for quite some time. We've seen him really make a splash in Harrisburg, certainly, and continuing to go back and organizing in his community. So to see him come up out on top, is really a classic example of people over money. It really, the money was flowing into Street's campaign, through the, top down type of channels that we normally see. Chris Robb raised a lot of grassroots money and had lots of people on the ground, and people knew who he was. And he's not afraid to be outspoken. People are pretty clear about where he came out on things. And, of course, that district, I'm sure people have heard, is the bluest district in the country. So it really was a battle over, what's going to be the shape of kind of the Democratic Party in that district. And then what kind of representation are we going to see going forward in DC?
Yeah, and we saw kind of a similar type of race play out in Bucks County between Bob Harvey and Lucia Simonelli. Lucia being the kind of like upstart progressive outsider, facing off against, Harvey, who has been active in Bucks County politics for decades, most recently in his current position as county commissioner, and before that as a Falls Township supervisor. And if we're being honest, things got a little heated within the Democratic
I
Party
think that's
in
true.
Bucks
I
County.
think that's true. I think that's I don't think that is a, I think it's a fair statement, to start from there. Absolutely. I mean, number one, we should say this is a high stakes election, right? This is it, at least the way that people are talking about this race come in the fall is this is a district that is being targeted as a possible flip. And at least what we're hearing at the national focus is that it looks like the Democratic Party is not just going to kind of like automatically assume Fitzpatrick is going to win this, right? They're actually targeting it and thinking about this is something that we need to flip. We'll see if that plays itself out. But this is, so this primary is really kind of important determining what that candidate is going to look like going forward.
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence that Governor Shapiro kicked off, the Democrats' general election in Bucks
Yep.
County on Tuesday night, along with Lieutenant Governor, Austin Davis and a host of others. So yeah, all eyes are on PA1, and I think that you're right. The DCCC and the local and state and national Democratic Party, they believe that this is their best shot to finally unseat Republican incumbent Brian Fitzpatrick, who, has kind of like foiled their past efforts time after time. And I think some of the debate that we were seeing in Bucks County was about like what's the best way to kind of do that. In the end, the voters decided was that it was rallying behind the Bob Harvey, the Bucks County, Democratic commissioner, over Lucia. But there is a sizable chunk within the Democratic Party that thought that Lucia represented the best chance because she was someone who was championing and articulating like bold progressive policy proposals, such as kind of like Medicare for all, centering climate change around her campaign. And they felt like maybe, I'm not saying they're necessarily right, but that Bob is just maybe too centrist, maybe,
Mhm.
or maybe too conservative in his approach to his campaign. And I think also a lot of people were turned off, and I think rightfully so, that the local Democratic Party just automatically backed
Yeah.
Harvey from the day he announced. This was before there was other candidates who announced their intention to run. And that's not unique to Bucks County.
No.
Let's just make that clear. That happens all over the country. But people felt like that the party was putting their thumb on the scales to help Harvey out and to kind of delegitimize his opponents who, while there was a few who had intended to run, Lucia was the only one who was actually able to gather the required amount of signatures to be an official candidate, which I think speaks, volumes to,
Absolutely.
that she does have support, because there was like three or four other people that just could not do
Yeah,
that.
and we should say too as well. Usually, when you see people at the leadership level of kind of like a party make the move that they did with Harvey, very often that's like an attempt to discourage anyone else from deciding to challenge it. Right? It's a this is like what really is practically speaking thumb on the scale right from the get go is that it's just like nope, everybody go away. You're not going to get our support if you decide to run. So try to make people second guess it. Now, and I'm not trying to suggest I don't know the mind of those folks, right? At that time. So, maybe it wasn't intentionally done for that way. I personally think it's hard to believe that it would be other than that. But even if they did not, if they got kind of so not to use like these people high on their own supplies, so to speak, like thought they had a really good shot. They had a plan they wanted to go forward and they wanted to go all in on the plan right from the get go. That's a problem if you're trying to build like the party up, because if you are telling people from the get go that we don't want to hear what you have to say, we don't want to have the discussion about what our party is about and what kind of candidate we want, you're just going to get what we give you, that's a problem.
No, absolutely. One thing that I was disappointed in was that there weren't more candidate forums between, Bob and Lucia. And I was talking to Steve Sakay on the phone. He's a local progressive Democrat and activist that writes for us on the opinion page. And he had a great idea. He was telling me like they should be like, doing like a town hall tours, like up and
100%.
down Bucks County, and that's how you're going to kind of really rally the base for one, grow the base for two, three, hear what the base has to say, which is like what maybe that's something that should be centered in your
Yeah,
campaign if you're going to like
let's
represent
bump
them.
that up to number one on the list.
Unfortunately, we only got one forum that I thought it was good. I thought it was very useful. It was run by the League of Women Voters of Bucks County, but it was a real shame that they didn't really take advantage of having, I think, like two really strong candidates, two articulate candidates, two candidates who have like thought out positions, whether you agree with them or
Yep.
not. Um, I hope that this is something that they change in the future. And that's how you build like a small d democratic
Yeah.
culture, in Bucks County and in PA1 and in the district, by getting people engaged in these kinds of events and activities. And that's how you organize people.
Yeah, and there was a weird, I don't know who was making these decisions in Bob Harvey's campaign, but I find it very strange. Like, for example, did not respond to the Bucks County Beacon's questionnaire about like the candidate questions. There seemed to be this informal pressure around things of saying, no, we do not want to appear at other forums. We did not show up with other candidates at other smaller forums. And that's just the whole idea that you need to quote unquote protect your candidate, right? You want to, for the general election, and keep them out of this public scrutiny is like such an, excuse me, ass backwards way of approaching like building that campaign, exactly as you suggest.
No, I agree with you. The Republicans are going to sling mud no matter what. It doesn't matter, and oftentimes it's going to be like mis or disinformation, right? You talking about healthcare, you shouldn't like shrink away from that or like hide from that. You can't be afraid of your own shadow like Brian Fitzpatrick is, right? You can't, and that's why Fitzpatrick like won't do any kind of
Right.
town halls, because he's afraid to actually let people know what he thinks and what he believes in, and what policies he's going to back or vote for.
Right, because every time that Fitzpatrick would show up if he had to show up in a forum, if he would show up in a forum, he's got two audiences he has to consider. The people that
Yeah.
he's pulled the wool over their eyes, right, with his kind of moderate label, and his funders, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, because really we know that's the operation. The operation is the money behind it. So if Fitzpatrick decided to speak to the issues of his base in ways that conflicted with the funders, then he's got a different kind of problem on his hands, right? So, but what is what the thing is about the Harvey campaign that really frustrated me was that if you do not get out there and again have these forums, right, you're not sharpening your message for your base, right? And those are the people that you need to get out. But still, like Sanacero and the folks in the kind of Bucks County Democratic Party seem to still be wedded to this kind of, we need to get the moderate voter,
Yeah.
without considering the fact that you need to turn out people for something. And I have to say, I'll just say this is the one thing that why I would have liked to see Harvey do more of those town halls is I was not happy with his like performance on some things during that town hall.
He was underwhelming.
Well, that's
I
what I
mean, he
mean.
really
It's
was.
like you're throwing like a wet blanket on the campaign by giving these kind of wishy-washy non-answers to things. And that I was like, that I think you and I talked at some point about that. That really made me feel like this is a really bad sign for the general, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe he answered like 3 or 4 questions a little better than Lucia, but if I was kind of like scoring it, I would have gave that performance to her. I just thought like her answers had
Yes,
more depth. They were more specific. I think she came into that with like more of a vision about how she was going to represent, her constituents and what exactly she wanted to do and the types of specific policies that she wanted to push if she was elected. And again, I think it goes back to what you had just mentioned about like them wanting to kind of play it safe. I
yep,
mean, I think like you have to tell people clearly what it is you believe in and what it is you're willing to fight for, even if you don't think you might necessarily win that fight, because otherwise, how are you going to get people to really like support you, and not just support to vote for you, but to support you in a way that they're going to kind of try to organize other voters to back you as well.
100%. And one of the things I want to just sketch out about the results of the election, and I think there's a really unhelpful narrative that can come out of this, for a couple of reasons. And one, and there's vested interests in this narrative on multiple sides here. But if you look at the results, Bob Harvey coming in at 65.77% of the vote, Lucia Simonelli coming in at 34.03%. One way of reading that is like, oh no, Bucks County really is kind of like this kind of like, moderates, kind of like central thing. They want that kind of candidate, right? And yeah, only a third of the people who came out voted for the progressives. So really, progressives are not over there, right? That would be one way of reading it. And I think that's a really one for all sides, like in that primary, a bad narrative. Because number one, I would say the primary driver of this kind of primary is going to be name recognition. Anybody who spent long time in campaigns, especially when you're attempting to build something, you know that you need to be around for a while before your name gets recognized. So in other words, you and I talked about this like last year, right? And saying Bob Harvey has got name recognition, he's been around in the community, and there's a lot of connections and networks that he has built, right? Both as a teacher and then as a representative. And that means something, right, in those
Yeah.
elections, right? And especially since he's been out in politics for a while. That has zero to do with his policies, right? It's zero to do with what he stands for. It just has to do with a factor in this. Lucia, right? Why it's bad? That's a bad narrative of Lucia. Lucia is like, Lucia came into this as was, that a piece that Bonnie Chang had in the Bucks County Beacon with like 6 weeks of really intense campaign and has 34% of the vote. That's huge. That's for somebody who was a virtually kind of unknown to most of the county, came away with 34% of the vote after people started hearing what she had to say. That is not something to be discouraged about for as progressives. That is something to be that you clock that up as a win, as something to build on.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, over 23,000 people voted for Lucia compared to just under 45,000 for Bob. That's pretty significant. Those are a lot of people, and then those are people that Bob's campaign, needs to reach out to or reach, right, and convince that they should support him, that he's going to fight for them, that he's going to fight for their values and their policy preferences. But I think like what this shows also is that we had mentioned Chris Rabb, who's definitely way to the left of Bob.
Yeah.
But there's no like cookie cutter kind of candidate solution for Democrats in Pennsylvania. Progressives might think, well, we need someone like Chris Rabb. Well, I mean, Chris Rabb is, he's the perfect candidate for his district because that's who they voted for. But if you look at like the other races across Pennsylvania, the Democratic nominees like run the gamut. So you have like Janelle Stelson in PA 10. She's running against Scott Perry. she's a former
Yeah.
Republican, right? And former TV anchor.
Yep.
You have Paige Cognetti, quote unquote, Page Against the Machine, the former mayor of Scranton, and she was first elected as mayor when she ran as an independent against the Democratic Party machine up in
Yep.
Scranton. And now she's the Democratic nominee in PA 8 running against Bresnahan. Sorry, mind freeze. And then you have Bob Brooks, who, kind of like comes off as this like blue collar. He's the head of the firefighters union, progressive economic populist, but and he supports like Medicare for all, which Bob doesn't support, free childcare for all, but he also pivots a little bit with certain issues where like he is kind of like centered about, or centered securing the border within his campaign, and has also suggested that we need more resources for overburdened police, which is that's not a progressive
Hmm.
policy priority.
Right.
So I think that's something that maybe gets lost, with folks, here in Bucks, or with progressives, or even on the other side of the other wing of the party, that the party, unlike the Republican Party, like the Republican Party now has one standard: will you lick Donald Trump's
Yep.
boots?
Exactly.
Right. So if you, and will you do that 100% of the time? So we see someone like Thomas Massie in Kentucky, congressman, he is very conservative. He's kind of like Liz Cheney. And but he has some principles that aren't necessarily tied to his party. So he crossed Trump two major times. One with like working with Congressman Ro Khanna to release the Epstein files, and then again with the War Powers
Mhm.
resolution. He co-authored that with Khanna, again teamed up with a progressive Democrat, where they found like common ground, and that drew Trump's ire. Trump backed his opponent in the primary, and now he's sent packing.
And
So,
let's be clear,
those are
this
like
is
two
this is
major
why, yeah, and
differences.
this is why it's so important, because Massey is not a moderate Republican,
Mm-mm,
right? I
mm-mm,
mean, that's got to be said.
no.
It's like literally, this is why it literally is what you said. Will you lick Donald Trump's boots? Is your criteria, because Massey, in no stretch of the imagination is this guy considered like a moderate. And just because he went into the war powers thing does not mean that he doesn't want to see kind of aggressive wars around there.
No, yeah, he's not
So yeah,
anti-war.
so let's just be 100% clear there. Massey is not somebody we see like, oh look, a moderate, come on over, you're one of us. Well, on that one
Yeah.
issue, right? Whether or not you should kind of obey the master every time.
But then, we might see like Democrats like try to roll out Massey, on the
I
campaign
look,
trail, like they did with the
right,
Cheneys,
as warped
which,
as this party is sometimes, I swear to God, I could totally see that happening. Like Massey, look, a man of the people, right? He's anti-Trump. This is what happens when you make everything just about Trump, right? I mean,
yeah.
this is where from the I still think that the argument from the left, right, for progressives and for Democrats, even in general, you got to have more than just not Donald Trump. You need to be running for something, and that's what we're seeing in the most interesting races around. Is that on the Democratic side of things, that's where the energy is. Not are you, I don't even know what to call that, but like, are you just like saying Trump bad man and that's your campaign slogan? I mean, that's not going to cut it anymore.
No, but I think that that's the trap like some Democrats might be falling into, that they just think that, just because of the national mood and like Trump's just plummeting popularity, that's going to be enough. That that wind in their sails is going to be enough, and I just don't.
No,
I don't think that's a winning strategy.
no, and also let me say this too as well. On the other side, on the flip side of this too as well, is among kind of progressives, particularly those folks that were supporting Lucia in her campaign, is like, take your lesson should not be from this that your only enemy is like the Democratic Party apparatus. look, I'm the last person in the world that's going to sit there and say that no, like you got to respectable. There are real problems, and go look at my history of any talking or writing on this thing, and you will see it. Right, that I probably spend more time with being critical of the Democratic Party because like this is what we've got, and on the left, this is what we've got. However, this is really worthwhile taking a lesson for like long-term organizing of what we see, for example, the Working Families Party, right? Working Families Party has been around since I was in college. I mean, was I'm before then even. I remember my first votes in New York State. You can have a candidate who's listed on two separate lines. So, for example, you could have a candidate who's endorsed by the Democratic Party and the same candidate who's also endorsed by the Working Families Party, and you can vote for that candidate under the Working Families Party, and it will still count for the overall vote getting. So you could have this double endorsement, but you can also support a particular party. In Pennsylvania, right, Working Families Party, they got behind and targeted 6 races and they won all 6. That is long-term organizing. And so when they would look at like, I mean, looking for internally what Working Families Party has done historically, you're going into these blue districts or even contested races, you're coming away from this looking at a 34% of the vote in this primary as a first time candidate. That is a huge win. That is something to build on, right? And I get concerned, right, about seeing some of the language coming out from kind of like the progressive end of things, is that it's just going to be a narrative up until the election about kind of like how bad the Democratic Party is, right? And again, I'm have all do that, right? But at the same time, is like this is a positive sign that can be built upon. And so what that says, okay, this message is a winning message, right? So that now you've got the next several years to build on the message. Get your head out of electoral politics now and get back into organizing in the community. That's kind of like, kind of what Working Families Party has historically done. This is what kind of like the DSA has historically done, right? That deep organizing is kind of the key around it.
Yeah, I agree. Two things. One, we talked about this issue previously, just like people were upset with, the party's bylaws, with the endorsement of the candidate before the actual primary. And those are things that can be changed. I don't think that was never going to be a winning issue to run on, as a campaign. But I think that's an issue to organize around moving forward. And, if you actually want to change the way the Democratic Party conducts itself, you're going to have to work with the Democratic Party and not like burn bridges. Like I think, some people, have or are trying have been trying to with some of the rhetoric coming out. But and then I think the other thing that I've been kind of like thinking about is whether groups like Indivisible should be tying themselves, to the Democratic Party, so explicitly. And there was even splits within Indivisible in Bucks with like Upper Bucks and Indivisible Bucks County. To me, I feel like their real power and impact and influence is organizing people around issues, because and when you tie yourself to the party so tightly, you kind of like undercut your own potential influence,
I agree.
especially because there's going to be times when if you're being honest, right, and if you're being true to your values, you're going to have to combat the Democratic
Right.
Party. What do you think about
I
that?
agree 100%. I mean, for me, it's like there are those folks who want to spend their time in reforming the Democratic Party, the bylaws, and all that kind of stuff. And like you said, those are changeable, winnable things that you can do and spend your energy on. And that is a kind of like a party factional kind of approach, right? That is necessary and important. At the same time, building around issues, building deep organizing is rarely something that parties do. They're organizations that are outside of the party structure that do and build that power there. Like, so for example, if we're talking about the housing issue you brought up, right? If housing becomes this key issue, then like I remember this is how Lucia originally kind of proposed this. You have these listening sessions to go, and she did some of this listening sessions around Bucks County to figure out like what matters to people. What are the issues that matter most? And then how do we begin to respond to them? And, and here's the key important and how do we respond to that, not just through the electoral process, right? But how do you respond to that in building power in the community? That for me, that has to do with the power of social movements, right? That necessarily makes a clean line between the movement work and the party work. That doesn't mean that there's not times that there's an alliance between the issues in a party or why you would get behind and support a particular candidate, but your power as a social movement, the power as a movement has everything to do with what you've done in the community and the pressure that you can exert. And that gives the social movement the power to be as critical of Democrats as they are of Republicans. Because if the goal is to move toward like an agenda that responds to people's needs to build that progressive base, then you need that degree of independence, right? I mean, I'm a firm believer in that. Look, I'm a member of union, like Abscuff is my union. I've also always felt really like not great when the union gets too cozy to politicians or a particular party for the same reason. You want to be as critical when you have issues that are affecting the working conditions of like faculty and staff and the experience of students about funding of higher education. You want the ability to go after Democrats as much as Republicans, right? And you want them to ultimately have to respond to you and your power. And then, when that lines get blurry, and I've said this before, when those lines get blurry, look, normal people who are not kind of like deeply invested in political machinations within party politics are going to look at that when those things get mashed together. They're going to look at that and they're just going to see this quote unquote outside organization is nothing but a front group and a shill for those parties. Right? People are not dumb when it comes to that. So I mean that's look, that takes practice to do that. And that's that kind of close alliance with factions within the Democratic Party as being just a party thing, I think works against the long-term organizing and building power in the community. But this is
Well, I think,
this is essentially what I just spent a semester teaching about. Seriously.
well, yeah, I mean, just look at the civil rights movement,
Exactly.
right? I mean, there's a perfect example. And from being out, because they were outside of the party, they were able to actually push the Democratic Party to actually do the right thing. It wasn't enlightened Democrats, that brought
Nope.
us civil rights gains. It was a very broad-based and ideologically diverse civil rights movement. Some parts very militant, that kind of created the conditions and influenced the political imagination and popular will of the masses that created the space for the Democratic Party to finally do what was morally right.
Absolutely. And let's also be clear that this is not an either or kind of choice. Among the left, this has long been like this. I always see it as a very superficial debate about whether do you work inside the system or outside the system. No social movement has ever been successful by forcing that choice upon people. Is like go back to the civil rights movement too as well. Is like yes, they are strong. The power was built outside, but when they had real movement allies inside, right? Because ultimately the goal, right, is to get voting, right? Is to stop the lynchings, right? It is to, and that requires legislation. And so then you build with real allies inside that will do their work inside, but they are not the same thing.
Yeah, and we have, I think, there's a lot of great Democrats working in the party that we
Absolutely.
have in Bucks County. And they are allies, whether they have an inside outside strategy or they're just solely working within the party apparatus. We wouldn't have the changes that we've seen in Bucks County, over the last 5 years without them, whether that's from school board races to the sheriff's race.
Exactly. And that right there, those are the models, right? And like this is, one things that was a little frustrating to see how nasty things got at one point is like we saw like the model of real change was visible in those school boards, right? It's about the people that did that work. I mean, they were not kind of like clearly aligned around like we are the progressives or we are the centrists, right? It was about we are here to save this freaking school from extremists who want to tear it apart. And then those coalitions around that issue were absolutely critical, right? In order to get that passed. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot, again, there's like just I think about this as kind of post-mortem stuff kind of going forward and really just think there's so much potential in the work that's gone on. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I've got something I would definitely want to talk about just about the Pinsley Merkel Gump race too as well for the PA Senate District 16, which is that district that runs Lehigh County down into Upper Bucks. What are some of your takeaways from that race?
Uh, you know, much like the Harvey Lucia race, there are some deep divisions, within the, I guess within the political left, I guess, or liberal left, especially like in Penridge, right? Darren Lawson wrote a really good piece championing Bradley
Hmm.
and the work that he did to help flip the school board. And then on the flip side of that, Laura Foster just had a different view, and she represented, I think, some people who maybe thought that Bradley and I think maybe the school board as a whole, I think it's safe to say, like maybe haven't done enough, haven't been vocal enough, championing policies to protect communities in Penridge that had been under attack for so long as a result of like a Moms for Liberty kind of super majority board that kind of ruled with impunity in Penridge for multiple years. So I think that was kind of again, it just showed some of the revealed some of the fissures within these some parts of the local party. I'm not sure whether locally in Penridge, I would think like a majority support Bradley. I mean, he was elected,
Yeah.
school board member, but and then I think the makeup of the district, is something unique. With such a large part being part of Lehigh County, and you have the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, and it tells such an interesting story, and this is where these kind of national narratives or blanket narratives about kind of like the party and the outside the party, they're not always very useful in terms of really looking at what's going on in a race. Because there's one narrative of viewing this to say, like, oh, look, here you go, Mark Pinsley, kind of like supported by Bernie Sanders, not endorsed by the Democratic parties, like despite that comes out into victory. And again, that is a narrative, right? And there's something to be said for Pinsley's stuff. I mean, Pinsley has a long record of progressive work. He's done excellent stuff in Lehigh County. There's no doubt about it, right? There's all that. So it's not like fake or anything like this. But then to need the binary, right? To basically say, well, and therefore that who's the establishment thing, and that is like Bradley Merkel Gump, and like so the establishment was beaten by like that is like for me the worst possible narrative to come out of this, because if you look at the numbers, right? So Pinsley won 54 to 46, right? That is a tight race. I mean, that is really significant, right? To see that there's this kind of stuff going on. But then if you look at, you break it down by county, right? In Bucks County, you had 70.08% people coming out for Bradley Merkel Gump, 29.63% coming out for Mark Pinsley. In Lehigh County, you have like for Pinsley, 72.98%, Merkel Gump, 27.2%. The third part of that story is that Bucks County had a higher voter turnout, 28%, 28.6%. Lehigh County only had 20.2%. So when you look at that, what the story is that this district, which was still fairly recently drawn and has more people in Lehigh County, that's what did it. And again, I would come back to name recognition in these places, right? Is that like Pinsley has been around for a while in Lehigh County, right? He's been active in the community. He's done real things to change, real people's lives. And people from Lehigh County and Allentown and Bethlehem, all this, they're not as familiar with who Bradley Merkle Gump is. They may have an idea about what happened down in Penridge. And then the flip side, if we look at the Bucks County turnout, right, we say, well, hey, look, 70% behind Bradley Merkle Gump. That says to me that people recognize what he did as part of that group of folks that flipped the school board, and they
Yeah.
value that. So this is a really important story, right? I mean, the important story here is not establishment versus outsider progressive, right? I mean, that's part of what gets in the mix, but I think it kind of unfairly characterizes, each both candidates in this. And I look at kind of what Bradley did here is like, and I'm not trying to kind of like say Bradley Merkle Gump single-handedly did this. No, he was part of a team of people that got elected, but that was let's not forget how horrific things were in the school district before they flipped the board. And so, in some ways, I would say that if the Bucks County Democratic Party, right, and Lehigh Democratic Party didn't kind of like jump the gun, right, and just they had stayed out of the endorsement process, right, this would have had a very different flavor to it, right? It would have been to say, here's two strong candidates that have two separate things. It was not kind of like insider outsider. Here's two strong candidates. Let's see like who's going to come out the strongest and who's going to get the votes here and let it play out. I think actually, the fact that Bradley Merkle Gump got the endorsement from Bucks County Democratic Party may have actually negatively impacted him because of what they did with Bud Harvey, right? It left a
Yeah.
bad taste in people's mouths. And, that's really unfortunate. So, I mean, look, so once again, we have two strong candidates here. And then it basically tells us in this district, in order to get elected in this district, it's going to take that work across those counties, right? And look, I'll tell you this: I know this for a fact. Is like Bradley Merkle Gump's campaign did gangbusters work by getting up there in Lehigh County. And I have to say this about Mark Pinsley when he ran last time. Right after the district was newly drawn, he was down here in Bucks all the time. He showed up at events and all the time. So that's what we see. This is a long-term kind of move here, but I don't think it so neatly breaks down in terms of like the progressives versus the insiders.
I am surprised how low the turnout was in Lehigh at 20. I mean, people are complaining about Bucks being
Yep.
low. And I mean, typically a primary isn't going to have gangbusters turnout, but still, we've been a little higher in the past, like 31, 32%.
Well, last
So
year we came second, and it was second highest in 2 decades turnout, right? We almost
wow.
broke like majority. It was like 49 something percent. So, and that was during an off year election, quote unquote, municipal election. That was huge
Yeah.
turnout for Bucks County.
I mean, I think it's going to be off the charts in November, unless there's like stormtroopers in the streets, I'd be surprised if we don't break a record in November
I'm
with turnout.
hoping so. I'm hoping so.
Yeah.
I'm
It
concerned
helps
about it too.
Democrats.
I think what this showed even in the primary is that I think people are tired too. And
Yeah.
I don't mean, just yes, the physical tiredness, but also kind of with the insanity at the national level. I think that has an impact, and it should, exactly you say, motivate people to get out there and vote. But it is a primary, so and people have all got their eyes on the fall. So let's hope that we're going to see that record turnout.
Do you think that, because maybe someone like Bob doesn't pass the progressive purity test, that people are going to abstain from voting for
I
him?
do think there will be a small group of people that will, right? And again, I think it is destructive. I think it is absolutely destructive to basically make the casting of the ballot about an expression of my kind of like personal morality, right? I always think elections are about you're making a choice among the choices that are given, and who can you push the most? Who can you have the most impact and influence over? And if you're thinking like a social movement, right, you're going to have a hell of a lot more opportunity to push Bob Harvey than you ever will Brian Fitzpatrick. So you want to kind of like abstain, you want to kind of vote kind of for Mickey Mouse, or like several people did during, during the primary for Thanos, at least in my precinct, which is a little disturbing if you think about it. But that's the way you think, right? The election is just this moment. And obviously, if you got somebody who's a Nazi in there who's running on there, I'm not, that's a different story. But you're talking about somebody like Bob Harvey, I think there's opportunities to push and build for that next round, at least in the electoral site.
Yeah, I mean, he's like you said, he's center left. He's someone that potentially could be pushed, but at the very least, he's going to be one more receptive, and then two, he's definitely going to be like, tons better than Brian Fitzpatrick. And I think this, flipping Congress is going to have an impact
Huge,
on people's lives, like a
huge,
tangible impact, especially like Black and brown people and
100%.
LGBTQ people, and then, maybe this is gonna piss people off, but I think if you're gonna not vote for Bob because he's not, like, your ideal candidate, even though you're definitely not voting for Fitzpatrick, that kind of comes from a position of privilege that a lot of other people, in the community, they don't have or can't afford to have. I mean, just think about like Hungary, right? When like Orban lost. Well, the guy he lost to was center right,
Yep.
right? But at least he believes in democracy. Imagine if people were just kind of like, well, he's center right. He is not passing the purity
So
test.
let's keep
And then you
Orban.
have it. Yeah, we'll have Orban for another, 16 years, because that's how long he had been in power before. I hope that doesn't happen. That said, like you said, it's a strategic act, and really, it's like, obviously voting is important, but what you're doing the rest of the year might even be more important if you're like organizing right around that. And I think you vote for Bob, who I don't think he's a bad Democrat. Is he as progressive as I would like? Probably not, but do I necessarily represent the voting electorate in Bucks County? Unfortunately not. Otherwise, like, AOC would be our czar.
Right, exactly.
Um, so, well, we'll see what happens. I'm interested to see how both he and Pinsley campaign in these coming months. Flipping the state senate, it's
Right.
huge. That would be huge for Pennsylvania, because really our hands are tied right now, only having one chamber, the House, and then only having like a one vote
Well,
majority.
here's a perfect example of it, right? These are stories that you ran in the Beacon. You saw this was it last month or something? There was that story that came up in Arkansas in the Ozarks about like the whites only community, right? And then there was an ordinance that was going to go forward, kind of getting passed in Pennsylvania, right? And the Democratic like assembly passed like legislation that basically said you cannot have whites only communities here, right? That is illegal, right? Now that goes to the Senate, right? And that goes to the state Senate, which has a Republican majority.
And not a single Bucks County Republican or any Republican state lawmaker voted to support the whites only community, white
The
supremacist community
anti-white
ban.
supremacist community.
Yeah, yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they seemingly they think that's fine, right? If they're not voting to ban it, and this movement had plans to expand into
That
Pennsylvania, which is why
exactly.
part of the reason why this bill came up.
Exactly. And so there's a concrete example, right? So if you're voting, you need something specific. Well, do you think that Pennsylvania should have whites only communities like supported by Christian nationalists and white supremacists? Right? Well, if you say no to that, well, the big stumbling block is the PA Senate, right? So that needs to flip. That's a huge thing. We could go down the list of things. Let's we go down the list on kind of environmental regulation. We could go down to kind of the list of funding for schools, right? Well, Pennsylvania is still in violation of of its own constitution for not adequately funding kind of all public schools adequately. So all that depends upon those things shifting. So absolutely. So I look at it like this: what a better opportunity for the left to organize around those issues in the lead up to the election, to basically establish the criteria by which you tell Bob Harvey, if he wins, that this is how you're going to govern. Right. And frankly, if I was the Bob Harvey campaign, like Lucia came out right away and said, like, hey, look, we're going to, this was a great campaign. We're moving forward. We got to get rid of Fitzpatrick. If Harvey's campaign was smart at all, they would look to Lucia, right, and other folks in that campaign that are kind of like, and say, let's meet, let's talk about how to kind of build this up. Like, if I was him, I would even kind of like extend, like, hey, you want an environmental consultation position on this campaign, right? Do you want to be our environmental go to? Why not do that, right? Why not kind of demonstrate this kind of going forward? It'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, she has just a little better policy chops, at least on the federal level, than, Bob does. I
Yes,
mean, he's been legislating at the county level, and I think he's done a good job. And if you look at his tenure, he's battle tested. He's kind of like confronted the MAGA blob with their torches and pitchforks, like time and time again. At these county commissioner meetings. But going back to that forum, again, he kind of like underwhelmed. Like when they talked about affordable housing, I think his answer, if I remembering correctly, was about raising the minimum wage, right? So like making like $15 an hour isn't going to allow you to be able to put down a down payment and afford a mortgage in Bucks County, one of the most expensive housing markets in the state. And so he definitely he needs to do a better job of doing his homework and bringing more voices into the campaign, especially someone like Lucia, who has federal policy making experience with her time working for Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse on climate and science policy. That's only going to help him.
100%. And like, otherwise, where's the policy? Where's the policy stuff going to come from? It's going to come from those Democratic Party consultants, right, who give us all this wish-washy garbage about what to stand for. Why not having someone right here from Bucks County, right, who was on the other quote unquote side of the primary, bring those folks in as a way to kind of say we need to beat Fitzpatrick. I mean, if the goal is beating Fitzpatrick, then that seems to be like a great move.
Yeah, it's just empty sloganeering, right? They're like railing about the affordability crisis. Well, then what the heck are you going to
Right.
do about it? And while we do need to raise the minimum wage on the state level, that's not a solution to fix, unaffordable rental prices or housing prices.
Yeah, it ends up being what a phrase that I've been holding on to that somebody has said to me, right? It's like the idea about kind of like admiring the problem almost, right? Like, look at the price of eggs, look at the price of eggs. Like, we got a problem with the price of eggs. Well, let's keep on talking about the price of eggs and how expensive things are. Okay. You need to actually have, the next footfall is like, and then therefore we are going to do X. I mean, we look at what Mamdani is doing in New York, is like, here's a problem, here's a solution, and now we're going to execute it. Right? And now all these kind of like young kids have free like childcare, right, and daycare and kind of like preschool education for real, right? That matters, right? So that same kind of stuff need to move in that direction. So, but crazy. I don't. I think we'd be remiss if just kind of like without mentioning just quickly that now Tim Hayes he ran unopposed in the primary. He's kind of been the head of the Dublin Borough Council, running in the 143rd against Shelby Labs. Tim Hayes is awesome, right? I mean, I think as a candidate,
Incredible.
as somebody who's actually shown that you can move from idea to problem to solution and get it done, and working with, like, again, working with the Republicans and existing to the point where they're supporting him, right? That kind of stuff, to actually shifting the board, right, to kind of a majority and flipping that in Dublin's town council. And he's got, you hear him talk about stuff, right? He's got what it takes, I think, to take on Shelby Labs, right? And get past that kind of, Republican machine, because she doesn't really have much to stand on her own. Right? It's just this kind of machine. I think Tim Hayes is going to be a really exciting candidate come the fall.
Yeah, he's someone to watch. He also has policy
Yes.
chops. He's been working on environmental policy for years. And I think he's someone that, like, identifies problems and offers actual solutions to fix them, whether it's about what responsible economic development might look like locally or on the state level, to kind of transitioning to green energy to lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. And I think he's just someone that can kind of talk to a broad
Yes.
audience, and that he's very relatable. And just part of that is, one, is it's his intellect, and then two, it's just it's his sincerity, or if not, like, authenticity. And like I mentioned before, there's only like a one seat difference in the House. We need to expand that majority for the Democrats to continue to pass that, in addition to flipping the Senate, so that we can continue to kind of like pass policies and legislation that are actually going to help like working families in Bucks County and throughout the Commonwealth.
100%. And I think that, Gwendolyn Stoltz ran in the 143rd last time round. Ran an amazing campaign. I mean, was out door knocking like every single day. Again, this was a newly drawn district. And I would say that one of the benefits of her campaign, other than just being just a fantastically run campaign, she didn't end up on top in that one, but still, but I think that she helped establish the 143rd as an identity, right? To saying this is who we are in this district. So I think that, Tim Hayes has just been all over the place too, as well. Kind of doing the door knocking, doing the kind of the interviews, and talking to people about what he's all about. So I'm really looking forward to seeing his campaign develop.
Yeah, and she represents like kind of like the hardcore MAGA wing of the Republican Party, the state Republican Party. I have to admit, like, there's a couple Republicans in Lower Bucks that will, sometimes cross party lines. Joe Hogan, and sometimes Casey Tomlinson. Not
Mhm.
enough by any means, but not Shelby
Right.
Labs, right? Like, if you want to raise the minimum wage, you better look for someone else to vote
Right.
for that, because she ain't doing it. If you want to forgive lunch debt for students that come from families that are struggling, yeah, she's not your person.
Not even
um,
close.
so yeah, I think Tim has a great shot to kind of flip that seat, and that's definitely, it's not only a race to support financially if you live in his house district, but to support with some hours, with some volunteer hours, if you can knock on doors, talk to your neighbors, organize events. He's someone that I think, like, someone that you can really get behind, and I think he's someone that's really going to go into Harrisburg with like a clear vision about how to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So go Tim, go Tim. So listen, to kind of close us out for the day, I want to do kind of two things. Like one, I want to see like things got, point out kind of things in the beacon, kind of particular pieces that you want to give a shout out to, and so that like what's kind of happening within there with some of the new pieces maybe coming out and so on. But before we get there, I thought maybe we could do a little kind of like ooh, looking back over Cyril's first presidential term at the beginning, the first 4 years. I mean, it's a milestone. I mean, really, in many ways, and I'm really curious about how you're thinking about this past 4 years with the Beacon. I mean, it's kind of a cool moment to reflect.
Yeah, time has flown by. That's for sure. So I started writing for the Beacon in February of 2022, and maybe like a month and a half later was named editor. And at the time, the Beacon, I guess, it's coming up on 5 years, but it was really it was still in its
Yeah,
infancy, right? It had a skeleton staff, so it was really a chance for me to kind of like build something from the ground up. And my background was independent media, especially like working over a dozen years with like Upside Down World. So I saw it as an opportunity to kind of build a progressive, participatory kind of movement media outlet as something that would kind of like add to the ecosystem, the media ecosystem that had already existed, like Raging Chicken
Mhm,
Media,
mhm.
or the Rick Smith Show, as well as it being a place to platform, progressive voices which had been blocked out of mainstream media outlets in Bucks County, specifically the Bucks County Courier Times and the Intelligencer, which either completely, ignored what this, huge part of the community was doing, and or while at the same time kind of really championing and platforming, far right voices. And that's why you saw, like, Bucks County was such a shit show 5 years ago. I mean, you had a local militia,
Yeah.
3% or so. You had the Proud Boys marching arm in arm with Republicans outside of Brian Fitzpatrick's office. COVID conspiracists. You had Moms for Liberty banning books, tearing down pride flags. Eli Wiesel
Oh
quotes
god.
being like ripped off doors and Central Bucks, because that was like quote unquote biased. And so, for me, I wanted the Bucks County Beacon to be, a shine of light,
Mhm.
not only on like some of these more far right extremist movements, but to shine a light on the good things that were happening in the community that weren't getting reported elsewhere. And to have like some kind of like unapologetic lines in the sand, like, no, we are not going to defend book banning, right? Like, which is something like the Bucks County Courier Times had an editorial essentially trying to suggest how the Central Bucks Moms for Liberty School Board could be responsible book banners, right? Like, that was not a position we were going to take. And, it's been exciting how much we've grown. I mean, one, I have to, just highlight the work of Jenny Stevens. So Jenny Stevens was like the first writer who kind of I recruited onto the Beacon, and just the extraordinary impact
Yeah.
that her reporting made, especially in your neck of the
Yeah.
woods, up
100%.
in Upper Bucks in the Penridge School District. She did a phenomenal job, just really, really just tirelessly reporting on what was happening in that school district. And I'd like to think that her reporting played an instrumental role in kind of raising awareness that turned the tide against this Moms for Liberty, extremist school board and their exclusionary kind of vision for public education. So I think Jenny Stevens was just really a huge part of the success that we've had. And then, like, it was a community effort, right? Whether it's like yourself being involved, opening up the editorial pages to local community members, whether it's like Kirsten Zoffo or Darren
Mhm.
Lawson, who did extraordinary
Yeah.
work, like uncovering this like secret like book banning
So
project
crazy.
by the school board in Penridge, where they banned books under the cover of like weeding out like old unnecessary copies that just happened to be all written by people of color or had LGBTQ
Just a
characters.
coincidence.
Just a coincidence, right? And we've seen a lot of growth. I mean, the first year in 2022, we had 77,500 views, 57,000 visitors. 23, 358,900 views, 251,000 visitors. 24, 410,000 views, 295,000 visitors. And then last year, 572,900 views and almost 400,000 visitors. So every year we're just
Yep.
growing and growing and growing and expanding our coverage. And now, Emily recently hired Darrell Lyons as our chief resource officer to help kind of like build up our financial infrastructure and expand. And she's been knocking it out of the park. She helped
100%.
secure us this new Report for America partnership, where when we just announced this today, that Ben Bennett, who is a former intern and fellow at WHYY, he'll be joining us for at least the next 2 years. And the hope is that we can expand that so he can be someone that just stays on for maybe the next
Yeah.
5 years. And he'll start officially in July, but he's already been freelancing for
Huge.
us, and he did a nice piece about a disturbing white supremacist flyer recruiting for the Patriot Front up in Quakertown. But he's going to do some education reporting for us. That's going to be his primary beat. But we'll also be able to kind of like give him some spot assignments for other things, such as that. We've expanded. We had the AP partnership that we secured and that we signed on to continue with the Associated Press. That's been huge for us. We'll be publishing something with Grist coming up on data centers. And this former Grist fellow who just ended her fellowship at Grist, she's going to continue to report on climate related reporting for us. We've been partnering with Technically. That was something that Dara was able to secure through her previous work we have a series of articles around election security. We've already published a few, and that's going to continue up into November. And they also did a pretty interesting piece about that we partnered with around how Bucks County school districts were starting to incorporate AI into their curriculums, which could be a whole other episode that we could talk about um,
Dude.
the pros and I would say many cons of that. But yeah, so it's been a fun 4 years, just kind of like watching this grow, watching our stable of writers grow with people like, Pat LaMarche, Jenny Cohn, who was writing for us for a long time around Christian nationalism and far right extremism, Sam Schrader, now Melinda Rizzo, Lee Davis, our amazing interns like Naomi Weiss, who did just a bang up job
Unbelievable.
last
Yeah.
summer. And congrats to her. She's at Spotlight Delaware this
Oh,
summer.
fantastic.
Yeah, so she's continuing to do great things, and she was like local homegrown, originally from Yardley, Pennsbury grad. We have Chris Hetrick this summer who'll be interning with us, and he's from Central Bucks. So it's been extraordinary, and I'm just really grateful to the readership who played just an as important role in helping us grow and sharing our work and spreading the word about the stories that we were reporting on, for being part of the stories, and for making the news, and for doing the organizing, and for winning the battles against
Yeah.
extremism, and bringing back progressive, common sense, sustainable solutions to what we're facing here in Bucks County. So yeah, and I still almost can't believe it's been four
Yeah.
years.
I know it's crazy. You know what? And I'll have to say, and we add to this is that what's been, I think, striking to me to see develop with the beacon is, on the one hand, the kind of expansion of the writers and the coverages that you just talked about, and having that commitment to building it out into the community and having people bringing in who are, already on the ground and having them writing those perspectives has been amazing. To have that coupled with someone like Emily Smith, who has been just unbelievable in keeping her eye on the prize about how do we build this? How do we strengthen this? How do we make this sustainable? And how do we find sources of funding and opportunities for this that is going to grow out the kind of, the organization at that level? It is so rare in my experience of having, being involved with independent media in a variety of different ways over, God, decades now. But to see those two things come together in the way that they have in the Beacon, or to have the kind of focus and the kind of commitment that you have as the editor in chief, and the kind of skill and commitment of someone like Emily Smith, right, as the kind of publisher of the Beacon, to be allied in building this out, I mean, has been like astounding in its accomplishment, from my humble opinion.
No, absolutely. I mean, Emily is the one kind of like behind the scenes, pulling the levers, help creating the conditions that allow me to successfully kind of do my job, and as well as the writers. it's just, publishers aren't really like the front face, of an organization, right? But she's the one like behind the scenes, kind of like, doing a lot of this work. And, her and Dara just launched a
Yep.
podcast, Behind the Beacon, which actually talks about
Yep.
this.
Exactly.
And if you're interested, you should check out that podcast, subscribe to it. It's coming out twice a month. I think there's an episode coming out next
Yep.
Thursday. So that really kind of what Dara and Emily are kind of providing with the podcast is kind of giving you a peek behind the curtain and just like letting you see how, the nuts and bolts about how the two of them are kind of like, building up the infrastructure that has allowed the Bucks County Beacon to flourish, to grow, to partner with national
Exactly.
organizations like the Associated Press, right? Like the oldest wire in the United States, or Report for America, or new publications like Technically. So I definitely want to encourage people to check out their podcast. Again, that's called Behind the Beacon, and then you can subscribe to that on Apple, Podbean. Or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Yeah, and it's fantastic. And like I think this is just an additional service to the kind of progressive media at large, to have a really frank and ongoing discussion about the running of the publication. Because I can tell you there have been independent publishers in the past. I'm not around here, but in particular, some national magazines and things like this, and the writers would have horror stories about what they had to face from their publishers, or constantly the journalistic arm being at war with the kind of administrative arm or whatever it might be. And in the Beacon, it's been incredible to see how those things work together. And it's what we need right now. I mean, it's about building at all aspects of kind of what y'all are doing is to really become, a beacon, right? But I mean, seriously, and I was thinking about, I remember, I'm not sure exactly when this was, but it was when Emily was kind of rebranding stuff with the Beacon, and I remember her circulating out some kind of like mock designs of kind of redoing that kind of stuff, and I thought that was like just this kind of cool moment of saying we've got a vision here, right, about
Yep.
what this is going to be, and it's like I had the same feeling when you were kind of like brought on as the I'm like, this could be something special, and it truly has turned out to be. So 4 more years for sure, Cyril. 4 more years.
And then don't forget the Beacon. It actually takes money to run. So if you can spare a little social change, even if it's $5 a
Yep.
month, that would go a long way to making sure that not only we sustain what we're doing now, but that we can continue to grow. So, if you can afford 5, 10, $15 a month, please just, come go to our website and then you can become a monthly sustainer.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. I think the voter guide is like where the support the beacon button is normally. I'm looking for where we got the beacon. Where is it on the
So the
thing?
support us, um,
Oh, here you go. It's on the side now. Okay, so yes,
okay.
head on over. Kind of this was going to be my end of the thing pitch. Like said to the buckscountybeacon.com. Go to buckscountybeacon.com. On the right hand side, on the sidebar that says "You need us, we need you." Support quality news. Give now. You can hit that support the beacon button, and then give what you can. And look, this is our opportunity to kind of come together once again and support this absolute treasure we have here in Bucks County, and to ensure that we're only going to get stronger going forward here. So head on over to buckscountybeacon.com, go scroll down, hit on the right hand side, hit that support the beacon button, give now, give a one-time donation, become a sustaining member at 5, 10, 25 bucks a month. And really this is just a moment, let's put it that way, a moment to kind of like dig deep, because we've got a lot of fight ahead of us, that's for sure.
Well, Kevin, it's been great chatting,
It's been great
catching
once
up with
again.
you.
I know I kept you longer than normal once again, Cyril. So it's kind of my MO, I think, what, what you do. But I appreciate you taking the time. Want to do this once again. And I'm sure that when we hit November, post November, hopefully it's going to be a very happy kind of upbeat post election kind of thing. But, we got a lot of work before we get there. That's for sure.
Well, Kevin, I just want to give one last pitch. We'll have to kick off Pride Month. The next episode of The Signal will be with Marlene Prey,
Whoop, whoop.
Founder and director of the Rainbow Room. So I just want to encourage people to kind of make sure that they tune into that, because we had a really great conversation.
This, just so everybody knows, a little behind the scenes, this is Cyril telling me I've got some editing to do. That's what he's doing.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. All right, everybody. Well, hey, listen, I thank you all for taking some time out of your day to kind of check in us with the Beacon. And just remember, keep on coming back for the Signal. You can subscribe to the Signal on kind of a Podbean. Go to the buckscountybeacon.com. You can kind of check out the podcast there. And once again, put the plug in, buckscountybeacon.com. Scroll down, hit the Give Now button, and give what you can to help make this even that much more sustainable going forward, so we are prepared for the fights ahead. All right, Cyril, great chatting with you, man, and we'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon, Kevin.
All right, everybody, we're out.
This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril Mychalejko, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.